to start with the reading. Okay. So I'm going to read from two different sections. First is going to be from the first the first real chapter or essay, Names and Other Prophecies. So this is actually one of the later essays that I wrote for the book. I realized that I just needed something that was kind of a starter, and something that my family always joked about was how I was born at the same time as Hurricane Andrew. And they had named me Andrew. And without really meaning to name me after the hurricane, because it was just a tropical storm when my mom went into the hospital. So my name has always been a really interesting place for me. And so I'll just start reading from the beginning and go just about halfway through before switching. Let's see how I do this. Oh, I do. I hold both. Okay. Okay. In 6th grade, Lexi brought a baby name book to recess. She claimed she could tell us what our names meant, and we gathered around her on the grass behind the playground, shoulders bumping shoulders, feet stepping on feet, each of us eager to learn. Lexi sat cross-legged at the center of our circle, the rips in her grass-stained jeans opening wide at her knees. She pulled her dark hair back into a ponytail and popped open the book on her lap, flipping to the A's so she could tell us her own name first, Alexandra. Origin Greek, meaning the defender of humankind. We oohed around her, mouths in tight circles while she smiled broadly, showing us her bleach-white teeth. Her best friend Ashley was next. Old English origin, combination of Esk and Leah, meaning ash tree meadow. Like a fairy or something, Ashley cried, raising her hands to the sky as if in triumph. Many of us laughed, and Lexi asked, "Who's next?" We each raised our hands and shouted, "Me, me, me," and one by one, she flipped through the pages of her book and told us our meanings, like some kind of personality test. And we took our names on like badges. At 12 years old, we played many games like this, folded cootie catchers and MASH, little games on paper that could tell us our future, who we'd marry, where we'd live, our careers and our cars, games to give us a little glimpse into who we might become. And around the circle we went. Derek, German, power of the tribe. Nathan, Hebrew, bountiful or given. Gina, Latin, queen. My best friend Josh from church, Hebrew for God is salvation, which seemed to track. My childhood best friend Taryn, American origin meaning Terran or of the earth. Then we arrived at mine. Lexi flipped the pages, the circle quiet as we waited. Andrew, Lexi said on repeat. Andrew, Andrew, Andrew. Here we go. She took a breath. So Andrew is Greek, a variant of Andreas, derived from honor, which translates to a male animal, most notably associated with Jesus' first apostle, Andrew. It's a masculine name meaning strong or manly. There were oohs around me, like those that rose around Lexi. Someone whistled, someone giggled. Josh patted my shoulder and said, "Nice, man, that's a cool one." But something deep inside me quivered. Something shrank. Manly felt so superficial. To me, it meant cold, emotionless, distant, strong, muscly, sporty. Someone who's obsessed with cars and beer and sex and football. Someone who's aggressive, even violent. It meant being the kind of person I never wanted to be. The naming went on, but I quietly left the circle. I trudged through the half-dead grass of the field behind the playground. It was early October in Utah, and a chill wind swept across my body. I tensed up, I sat back down on the ground, crossed my legs, and pulled at the green-brown grass in front of me, yanking blades out by their roots. I tore them into tiny pieces, and when the wind picked up again, I lifted them to be carried away by the air. In 2021, NPR's Diana Opong did an interview with baby name expert Laura Wattenberg and professional baby naming consultant Sherry Suzanne. In the interview, they discuss why giving names to children can be such an overwhelming prospect for parents. They give advice to ease the burden. I don't know this stress myself. I do not have children. I am curious, though, as to how one person chooses the name of another. What goes into that decision? How do you reach a conclusion? How do you grapple with the knowledge that your child will have to live with whatever choice you make? Utah is known for its strange names. There are TikTok feeds and Instagram stories rife with the ways Utah parents spell popular names in unique ways, or make up new ones altogether. One Utah man even made a website, utahbabynamer.com. Just pick a gender, set a creativity level, and click the button. You'll find names like Coney Harfito, Scott Sharker, Jared Rax, Beggary Righted, Hannah Lane. These are all like Hannah, but it's Hannaugh, by the way. Briley Evelyn. Maybe the generator is easier, though it seems much more like a joke than a real way to choose a name. In the interview, Sherry tells us names are like art and not like science. So there is no right answer. There's only what you feel. Laura adds that there's been a revolution in naming. It used to be about fitting in, now it's about standing out, individuality, like a contest to see who can be the most creative. It's a label, and like many labels, it's one we're given, maybe the first one we're given. For most, we hold it for the rest of our lives. I had a friend in my undergrad years. She and her husband didn't care for their own last names and the family history that came with them, so they chose their own when they got married. Hawk. My father's cousin was once named Ski Earl Kingdon. The other kids bullied him. They called him Squirrel Kingdom. He changed his name since then, but I can never remember what he changed it to. There is something important in the stories of the names we choose and in those chosen for us. I'm searching for meaning, a sense of belonging, some purpose to hold on to. I was named after a hurricane, or at least this is the joke my family tells around the dinner table. I was born on August 21st, 1992, and when my parents entered the hospital in Salt Lake City, 3,000 miles away from Miami, Hurricane Andrew was just a tropical storm. By the time they left the hospital, the storm had become a Category 5 hurricane, the most destructive to hit the United States at the time. But my parents hadn't heard the news yet. They couldn't know what they'd name me after. Ironically enough, the joke that I was named after a hurricane stuck because of how well it seemed to define me. I was a chaotic child, energetic, eager, and thrill-seeking. In the summer before I turned 5, I climbed to the top of a silver maple tree in the front yard of our home. I was the youngest of 5 siblings, 3 older brothers and 1 sister in the middle of it all. Still, only my eldest brother, Matthew, 14 at the time, could climb to the top to help me down. Later, when I was 12, I was shot out of a tree with an airsoft gun. I cracked my ribs and bruised my intestine and spent 2 nights in a hospital where I watched Twister with my dad. You don't know.
If you know, you know.
Yeah, you know. My earliest accident came just a few months before I turned 3, where I tipped myself off the heavy kitchen bench. The bench smashed my big toe, carving the toenail through the skin. I limped through the kitchen, blood pouring from the wound, my heel thumping on the tile, screaming for my mom who was doing laundry downstairs. She sprinted into the kitchen, rushed me to the hospital, left the house so fast that she forgot to close the front door. Now my parents tell the tale of stitches to guests when they meet me, a kind of icebreaker, the same one I used to trick my peers and teachers when we played the 2 truths and a lie. I had stitches 6 times by the time I turned 7. After the game, I would point to each scar in sequence, a nursery rhyme of my body. My toe, my chin, the bone below my eye, the center of my head, the left of my head, and another on the right. 6 times before I turned 7. It always got a laugh. My family calls me a hurricane as a term of endearment, and I feel their love when they do, as if nothing the world throws at me can stop me from moving forward. Back then, I was happy to believe I wasn't afraid of risk. Growing up in the Mormon religion required a variety of ceremonies, rituals, tests, and covenants. A blessing once born to give you a name, baptism at 8 years old, weekly sacrament to renew promises made at baptism to avoid sin, other more complicated things. One of the most sacred ceremonies was the endowment, a ritual in the Mormon temple designed to help members prepare for the afterlife. The ceremony is a complex one, comprised of a scripted reenactment of the Bible's creation story and the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, a symbolic washing and anointing of the body, and the gift of the temple garment which we promise to wear at nearly all times, within the temple and out. Guys, this is so weird. This is some of the weirdest stuff. Yeah. Members are also taught hand gestures and passwords along the way, secret codes needed to enter through heaven's gates. One such code word was a new name, a heavenly name, the one you'd need to speak at the veil in order to pass on. To qualify for the endowment ceremony, a member had to either be preparing for marriage or be called on a 2-year proselytizing mission away from home. In 2011, just after I turned 19, I completed my endowments as a part of the latter. I was given my special garments and was taught the special words and handshakes I would need to get into heaven onto a better afterlife. Ishmael. That was the new name they gave me. They told me I must keep it close, keep it a secret, tell no one. Kind of shot that horse in the face. It was my password, and I whispered it to myself as I drove back home from the ceremony. Ishmael, Ishmael, Ishmael. It felt like a prophecy, some destiny to live up to. I knew the secret names came from the Book of Mormon. I would search for its place when I got home. Until then, I kept chanting because this was God's name for me, the one he'd given to me in heaven, the one I'd whisper back like a key. So, names, especially in Mormon insanity. I did eventually learn that it was all fake in a way, that the naming, it's in the essay, but the naming, they end up like choosing the day of the month. And everybody who goes through that day gets the same name. And it's the same on every one of like the 1 through 31 days. So anybody on the first will have the same heavenly password name. Yeah. The whole thing. Very strange. I felt very lied to, which is fine. And the whole thing is lies. But okay. The second part I'm going to read is one of the Wolf Boy interludes. So how the book is set up is in these acts, kind of semi like a script. Has to do with a lot of theater things, a lot of different stuff. And so I have these interludes that come before each act that pull into the wolf metaphor that's going throughout. Because honestly, I just love wolves a lot, and they showed up a lot in my life. Let me just check the time.
You're good.
Okay.
This is right.
Appreciate you. Okay. So this one is on, if you're reading 142. Once upon a time, there was a boy lost in the woods. He came upon a wolf, and the wolf asked him to dance. So they danced. They danced and danced and danced away from the path into a field of wild rainbow flowers. The wolf picked one at its stem and gave it to the boy as a gift. The boy graciously accepted and placed it in his basket full of bread. When he looked back up, the wolf was gone. The boy was alone again, lost in the woods forever, or so the story goes. At 13, I still went to church every Sunday morning. In sacrament meeting, a man stood at the podium in a bright white shirt and red tie, and he told us a parable about a merchant and his perfect pearl and the jewel box he'd crafted to hold it. When the merchant proudly displayed his treasure to others, he found the people loved the box more than they admired the pearl. When the man at the podium told us this tale, he also told us it was a metaphor for our bodies. He claimed that we were also focused on the container. We had forgotten the purpose for which it was built. As he continued into stories of Peter and Jesus and John the Baptist, my mother's voice rang in a whisper behind me. "Andrew, stop holding your breath." And I released air from my lips like a gasp because I hadn't realized I'd been holding it. My mom took my hand in hers and smiled. "You have to stop doing that, honey," she told me. I nodded because I knew she was right. No, I nodded because I knew she was right. But how was I supposed to stop a thing I didn't know I'd started? A few weeks after returning home from my mission, I tried to become friends with Dane again. Dane is a friend I had in high school who was not really a friend and did some mean things. But I had a big crush on that I didn't realize was a crush. So I tried to become friends with Dane again, some taste of a high school crush lingering in the back of my throat. And he seemed to want to be friends too. So in that attempt, I never asked about the yearbook ghosting, and he didn't bring up the window incident. Perhaps we both wanted to pretend those parts of ourselves weren't real. I should have known by then that things are never that simple. He left on his own mission to New York City a few months later. I went to his farewell talk. He told me to keep in touch, and I did, for a while at least. I came out soon after he left, and I never told him, too afraid of how he might respond. It just seemed like a conversation better had in person. 2 years later, a year into my relationship with Jed, I messaged Dane's mom to see when he was coming back. I knew his 2 years were up, and I hoped there would be a good time or day to come by and say hi and congratulate him on his return. I got a message from her account a few days later. "Hello, Andrew. There's no need to contact me. Please do not try through my family. Thank you. Dane." I never saw him again. There's a wolf sanctuary in Indiana where I watched wolves jump and snarl and play. I was also told I couldn't join them. Years later, in the North Carolina Zoo, I saw red wolves trotting through their enclosure, and there, on the other side of the fence, I felt a familiar yearning, like calling, some desperate wish a familiar yearning, like calling, some desperate wish to touch, to run and jump and hunt alongside them. That night, I emailed the zookeeper. I told him I was writing a book with wolves at the center. I told him I wanted to get closer than I'd ever been, to meet them, maybe, if possible, even touch one. It felt so strange to me, this desperate wanting to pet a wolf. It seems arbitrary when I think about it logically. What difference would it really make to be up close, to touch, to feel the vibration of their heartbeats alongside mine? So after emailing, I told myself it didn't matter that much. I can always go see them, witness the wildness from afar. It would be good enough, even when I was so tired of accepting a life that was good enough. I was so tired. The next day, he emailed back, and he told me he would love to sit down and chat with me, but it wasn't possible for me to meet the wolves. And though I knew this was the likely answer, it felt foolish to care so much. I dropped my head to my desk and cried. When it comes to fairy tales, my favorites are those that are rewritten. Into the Woods, The 10th Kingdom, Wicked, Once Upon a Time, the latter being a TV show that reinvents Little Red Riding Hood to also be the wolf from the Peter and the Wolf story, a shapeshifter, though she does not know this at first. She learns she is a wolf when she devours her lover, Peter. As the full moon pulses in the sky and Little Red finally wakes, she finds Peter's remains in the red-stained snow, and she screams. This is different from the Little Red in Into the Woods, who after being carved out of a wolf's stomach sings out into the audience that she knows things now that she didn't know before. That capes can't actually protect you even when they should. And it doesn't come as a surprise that when we see Little Red in the woods during the second act, she's wearing a wolf's skin and bearing a dagger like a fang. So I suppose she's right to sing her song. After all, wearing sheep's wool did not save Aesop's wolf. Wearing grandmother's clothes didn't save Little Red's. It's a moral I'm so desperate to learn. There are many wolves in Norse mythology, most having some relation to the trickster god Loki, most famous for tricking another god into giving him information on how to kill Balder, beloved son of the Allfather Odin. And it was the death of Balder that brought Loki's destruction. After Balder was killed, the other gods forced Loki to watch as they transformed one of his sons into a wolf and made the wolf tear apart his second son. Then they used his son's entrails to tie him to a pile of rocks deep in the earth. Crazy. Some of the stuff. And since that wasn't enough, they decided to hang a serpent above his head that would drip a venom onto his face for eternity, searing and burning, causing Loki to grind his teeth and scream and tremble. A just punishment, right? And he should be punished. I mean, it makes sense. He's the villain of the story of the gods. But still, it just seemed cruel. And yet, I felt some kind of sorrow for Loki, for this incredibly cruel fate. When I held up my hand in a graduate Norse mythology course to question whether his punishment fit his crime, a girl in class interrupted me. "It's what he deserved," she said. "He's the cause of all suffering in the world. He'll bring about the end of everything." I paused because her words were ones I'd heard before, an all too familiar argument. And it wasn't a surprise to hear it. I knew she was a devout Mormon, just like I once was. Her vernacular was that of Sunday school, where I learned of Satan's rebellion, where I learned about Eve's. "I guess I just understand why he might be angry enough to do that," I said. "Maybe the gods deserve to be destroyed." 8 years ago, when I first began this book, I didn't know it was a book I was writing. I didn't plan for any essay to be a plot in a larger narrative arc. I simply followed the request of a teacher to list off the top 10 things I was too afraid to write about, and then I wrote about them. Essays about God and sexuality and my body. I just wanted to tell the story. And over the years, essay by essay, I saw the structure build. The essays, just fragments of self, written by a boy trying to figure out what the memories meant, and how he became a wolf and not a wolf. Years later, while sitting on the floor of my tiny one-bedroom apartment, I wrote essay titles on sticky notes and laid them on the ground and found a pieced-together narrative in the stories I wrote while living them. Stories about Mormonism and sexuality, my family and my friends, how I hated my body and craved the bodies of other men, how I fell in love and out of love and contracted HIV, and how, just a month before, I tattooed "I choose joy" on my forearm. If you feel tangled in the narrative, fighting to loosen the knots, that's okay. I understand. I'm here at the page, and I'm telling you to keep pushing through. We're entering Act 3 here, and Act 3 is supposed to bring resolution. All these pieces crashing toward each other. We're working our way toward the finale, and I have to believe an answer is coming. Wolfish terminology is as follows. Swedish and Norwegian varg, Icelandic varger, both have double meanings, wolf and wicked person. The Gothic word vargs, varg in Old High German, work in Middle High German, varag in Anglo-Saxon, stands for murderer, stranger, outlaw, evil spirit, and wolf. Those declared as wargs are banished forever from human society, forced to live in the wild. In J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth, wargs are giant beastly wolves ridden by orcs and feared by others. In George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, wargs are people who can enter into the minds of animals, can see through their eyes, can control their actions. One of the main characters of the series, Bran Stark, gains these abilities and uses them to journey into the ancient northern wildlands. While he can warg into crows and magical weirwood trees, throughout the Seven Kingdoms, he most commonly links his mind to his companion direwolf Summer. These words and others like them revolve inside my head as I try to navigate their stories. A warg is a wolf, a wicked person, an evil spirit. A warg is to be sent into the wild. Bran is a member of the Stark family represented by a direwolf in his coat of arms. He is a warg and he is one of the heroes of his story. He is sent into the wild. He is protected by his wolf. I am interested in definitions and double meanings, in contradictions and contronyms, how we can weather a storm or we can weather and wear away, how we temper to soften, how we temper to build. From dust to dust, we sprinkle our particles and then wipe them away. There's something to understand in this. As the stories go, I am either wicked or good. So here, flip a coin. Place me in a version of the story that makes sense. Hero or villain, hero or villain. I'm tired of trying to figure out the part I get to play. Flip. Stop. Open your hand. Look closely. Tell me, where are we going next?
Woo! Thank you for that reading. I was entranced. I could listen to you read for another couple hours. Love the work you do around naming throughout this book. It really resonates. I feel like we have sort of like two pieces about names in conversation. And I don't know, it's fun to hear. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions and we'll talk a little bit and then we'll open it up for a little audience Q&A if y'all are interested, if you've got some burning questions. One of the things that I want to start with is that I just love how this book engages with fairy tale. And we got a little taste of that in your reading, which was beautiful. So I'm just interested to hear you talk a little bit about how fairy tales influence your work, and then maybe more broadly, like the magical or fabulous traditions, how that has influenced you and how you are engaging with it in this book.
Yeah, fairy tales are just, they're so fun to write about because they're so weird half the time. They're very dark a lot of the time. But what I always found so interesting about them was this idea that there was very clear and defined good and evil in them, always because it's that childlike thing. And I became even more invested when as I was reading, or what I read from that moment of, here are how we are subverting those ideas. And that's where I became really interested in fairy tales. And I started using them as a way of investigating hero and villain narratives, because so often in my own life, I felt like the villain. I had an affair in my marriage and I caused a lot of pain. I felt like I was a villain to myself half the time. And so I started to feel very connected to villains of stories, which I thought was really interesting. And if you've ever read, Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, talks about like the queer narratives around Disney villains, which has been a conversation beyond just her anyway. You just look at any of them and there's just queerness all over in Disney villains. And they're also the coolest.
Yeah.
So I knew from the beginning that I was interested in writing about it, interested in writing about what those subversions could look like and how in that way I could subvert my own ideas about who I was in my own story, so to speak. And so it's something I'm still doing. I love mythology. I love these stories that get retold and retold and retold, and why they stick with us. And because they do, these stories always stick with us.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Ursula.
Ursula.
I always think about Ursula.
Gaston. Jafar.
All of them.
Like, they're all just so queer.
We can talk about that.
Talk about it for so long.
So you mentioned in the second piece that you read, you sort of do this kind of cool fourth wall breaking that I love, writing about writing. And you talk a little bit about the kind of fragmented structure that this book takes, which is one of the things I love most about it, is both that kind of like, those of you who haven't read the book yet, there's a lot of braided essay and then fragmented pieces that sort of come together and create this like really interesting tapestry. So I'm really interested in that kind of like formal experimentation that you do, both in that fragmented form, but then also some essays take on totally different forms. I wrote down some of the ones that are notable: Mormon Lessons on Modesty and Dictionary of the Voiceless, which I loved. So could you talk a little bit about your process for creating these experimental pieces, like what experimentation does for you in your process, how it shows up in your kind of final works, and then how you see it serving the stories?
Yeah, no, I love that question. I love playing with form. I love what it can offer, especially in creative nonfiction, but even in fiction and in poetry, it can offer such cool ways of looking at stories. I especially think when emotions get so big and they feel like you can't wrangle them, having a form that is a little bit more strict can help, or at least helps me navigate some of those really big emotions. Gives me something to put them into as a type of container. So there's that part of it. I also knew, especially with this, that definitions were really important. One of the themes I'm looking at so often is how we are defined by ourselves, by culture, by friends and family. And so having a piece that is literally dictionary definitions that starts breaking down, and this sort of removing of the self from the dictionary was something I really wanted to showcase. And then when it comes to the fragmented stuff, I think it's just a lot of ways how my memory works. It's hard, telling something just fully chronologically, beginning to end, I feel like just doesn't get at the weight of what an experience is. Mm-hmm. And when we have conversations and we tell stories, we don't often tell them chronologically. We kind of go back and forth and talk about how this thing relates to this other thing and how that relates to a Disney character, and I think I wanted to write it that way. I naturally wrote it that way, but I wanted to keep it that way because it's just what felt natural to the experience. Because even in therapy, that's how it goes. We talk about this thing, which connects to that thing, which connects to the thing back when I was 5, and to this thing that happened when I was 28. And I think following that kind of intuitive way really helped with the process, and also felt a lot more true to the experience of it. In that form play, I think I played around with a lot of different forms. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. There's a lot of failure, so to speak, in experimentation. And so for writers out there, I'm still trying to learn how to be okay with that. But it's something I think we all have to learn to be okay with.
Yeah, that's the thing about experimentation. It's play. It's a form of play, and you have to be open to just sort of like diving into it and seeing what comes. And like you said, some of it's going to work and some of it isn't. And you can't find the good stuff unless you get through some of the not great stuff.
Yeah, well, and you've done braided stuff as well.
Yeah.
So, maybe you agree. I find that if I know kind of where I'm trying to go with it, braiding doesn't work.
No, and also if I know where I'm going with it, it's not fun. No. It's I'm not interested in writing a story if I know where it's going. The fun is in the process of I have no idea what's happening.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. And I'm just going to follow it. Like you said, like it's associative. I talk to my students, about this all the time, that like following the rabbit hole, like letting yourself fall down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Eventually you have to bring yourself, like crawl yourself back to the top, but like that's where you find all the connections and like the Disney villains and the historical pieces and the language and all of that stuff, and that becomes the story, which is super fun to write.
Yes.
And I think read.
Yeah. Well, and like the piece in there, my main kind of braided essay in there is one that is about my mission, about the Hurricane Andrew, and then about exploring a cave. When I first started writing that, I had no idea that any of it really connected.
Yes.
And it wasn't until 3/4 of the way through that I started to see what was happening. I was like, oh, there is something to this.
Yeah. That cave. I love it.
The cave. Caves are fun.
This is kind of like a continuation of that question, but I'm interested in like how the book came together structurally overall. I think this is kind of a memoir and essays. I don't know if you conceived of it that way. That's how my book is often billed, and I didn't conceive of it that way. But as I kind of put the essays together, I did see how this kind of memoir started to emerge. So I'm wondering kind of like what you were thinking as you were putting it together, how that shape started materializing, decisions around order. Like,
oh, God.
Yeah, it's
order
hard question.
Order is rough. I won't go there yet. I didn't conceive of it as a memoir and essays, at the beginning. For one, I didn't really even know what that was. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that was a thing. Yeah. So I kind of was like, basically at the end of my first graduate degree, and I had written a thesis that was the beginning of like a more chronological type of memoir, and I'd done like the first third of it for my thesis. And I had all these essays that I'd been writing over the past like 5 years before that. And there was this competition in Utah that was free to enter. It was a free competition, just enter it. Just throw stuff into the wind, because you never know what might happen. I had no thought that I might win this thing. But I had to have 50,000 words. I was like, I think I might have that much over these different projects. And so I pooled all the stuff that I thought was, really strong. And I had like 43,000 words, which I was like, that's really close. That's like one more essay and I can enter this thing. And in doing that, I also started to see patterns in what I'd been writing. Especially because I write to kind of process things. And so that writing to process in real time meant that everything was connecting, and it all connects through me anyway. But I saw that there were a lot of wolves, which I had no idea that I was, like, I knew they were my favorite animal, but I had no idea that I was writing about them so much, and that they had such a presence in my life. I saw a lot about Mormonism and a lot about sexuality and my coming out experience told in these different ways. And in the end, it became pretty simple to start attaching those things. It didn't take that much work because, it was all from me anyway. Part of that, like trusting the process, which I kind of hate, but is also the answer all the time. Yeah. So I put it all together and ended up winning this competition. I got like $1,000 and possible offer of publication, which is a whole other story, because it didn't end up going through. But it made me realize that I think I had something. And so I was able to go back to the drawing board a little bit. I wrote a few more essays for it. I made sure that wolves kind of were present throughout every essay in some way, even if it was just in metaphor or language. Like in that braided essay, there isn't a wolf, but I had already started describing the cave and with wolf-like features. You get like going through the mouth of the cave, and part of it is like the great heart of the cave, so it already has body things. And I think you just start seeing the patterns that we all have when you start placing your work next to each other. And I literally had those sticky notes, right, titles and what they were about, and I was like, wow, there's a lot connecting. And so again, it's hard to trust the process, but that's generally speaking how it all came together.
Yeah, we love the sticky note game.
Oh, sticky note game.
So good. Such a good revision tactic. All right, where are we on time? I have a couple more questions. I feel like I'm going to combine two of them. The next one, kind of talking about, you mentioned that you often process things as you write. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, like anyone who writes creative nonfiction knows it can be challenging in very specific ways, not least when we're writing about traumatic things, which can often feel like reliving those traumatic things. It's really hard, and I think people who don't do this kind of work don't quite realize like how re-traumatizing the process can be. And I know like some of my students are thinking about this a lot right now. How do you do that without hurting yourself? How do you kind of like protect yourself? And maybe you talked a little bit about that in terms of form, like how form can kind of serve as like a boundary that protects you from the story. Other ways you kind of write through the hard stuff and survive writing through the hard stuff.
Yeah. Form is definitely a way. I think what it really comes down to is finding avenues of play in it where things start to not feel so serious sometimes. That can come in forms of research. That's why braiding, I think, can help a lot because they're just those breaths of fresh air that you get to have where you're not kind of in the deep trauma of it. And it also helps the reader, I think, get through it that way as well. Where it's like, here's this really deep trauma, let's breathe a little bit and get kind of at metaphors and different things and then go back in. I think we all kind of need that. So that helps. I think we also have to be patient with ourselves as we process these things because it can be a little bit re-traumatizing. And if it starts to get too much, I had to become okay with stepping away for a second. Like, okay, let me not feel all these deep things all at once right now. Let me take a step back, kind of go back to real life for a second, and then come back in. And learning that patience was hard because I just wanted to like get it down. So it's a balancing act that I think you have to find. But when, with processing things, I just found I became most honest when I was writing, where I was lying so much in my life, even to myself. I found that through writing, I was finally able to be honest. And in a lot of ways, that was relieving rather than traumatizing. It can be both, which is why you just have to pay attention to how you're feeling about things. But a lot of ways, it just felt like I was able to breathe because I was putting it out there and it just wasn't only in me anymore. That it had found a place outside of me, so it wasn't taking over anymore.
Yeah, great answer.
It's a good question.
Taking that one step further, now that it's a book in the world today, people, this is the official pub day, so just big congrats. Yeah. This thing is in the world.
In the world.
So now that you've put it out in the world and you've given it away and people can read it, how does it feel? I'm thinking specifically about it's a wild time to be a queer writer. Books are being banned, people are being erased. How does it feel to have this book out in the world now? And I think it's also important to note that this series is really cool. This is part of a series put out by UW Press, Living Out, right?
Yeah, Living Out.
Yeah, and they've been publishing queer nonfiction, like autobiographical stories since like early 90s.
Yep.
So to be a part of this kind of lineage in this moment, like, how does that feel?
I mean, mostly exciting and very cool. I remember when I got the book, and at the back it has like the list
People,
of like all the books that have come before in this series, and then to have mine amongst that was very cool and overwhelming. It's a mixture of that excitement and fear, I think.
Yeah.
You know, there is the fear that when you write in these very honest places and in nonfiction, you never know how people are going to react. People you know, people you don't, you don't know how you're going to come across. And especially where my goal was to be as honest as I could in this. And I allow myself to kind of paint myself as the villain sometimes. You know, I'm very upfront about my affair and the cheating that I did. And I talk about, you know, the first time I masturbated. And like, you know, so there's very honest parts in there that if I think too deeply about, I start to get very stressed that that's out in the world. So I try to just kind of...
It's better not to think about it.
I'm like, well, I wrote that. It's there. I don't know. It's fine. But it, you know, it's that mixture. I try to focus a bit more on the excitement. My partner helps me with that because I start to go into the fear a little bit too much sometimes. But it's really cool to know, especially at a time like this where voices are being silenced. I know that what saved me when I was trying to figure out what was going on after my mission and I was depressed and, you know, thinking about ending my life, and I saw this video online from BYU students. BYU is like the Mormon school college in Utah. And they were telling their stories and they sounded very similar to mine. And they were these queer kids who just went through very similar things. And it helped me finally understand, one, that like what was going on, that I was gay and hiding it from myself. But also, two, that I wasn't alone in it. And that was enough to keep me going. And so the idea that I might be able to be that voice for another person, just to say, like, you are not alone in these crazy things that you're feeling and going through. I mean, it's everything. It's the entire reason I wanted to have this published, you know, because admitting a lot of stuff like that isn't necessarily like the most exciting prospect of my life, but the fact that it might be able to help someone makes it worth it for sure.
Best answer.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. If y'all have some questions about the book, about the process. Anybody got questions? Oh,
No, please, no, you. No.
I'm gonna call on Jared.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. This is a great reading. I'm excited to read it. Obviously, I haven't yet, right, since it just got published today. But I guess this is more of like a nonfiction question as a fiction writer, right? How do you? So you kind of answered it in the second reading, but you know, I think about Lydia Yuknavitch writing The Chronology of Water, and now she has one called Reading the Waves. And so I'm like, I haven't read that one yet, but I'm like, is it about similar topics? And like, how do you decide this is one memoir, and then because presumably you want to write another one or essays, right? Like, how do you know what I mean? Like, how do you not do all my greatest hits on one?
Oh,
you know?
gosh.
Yeah.
It's a very stressful thought sometimes. This is actually something that my partner Terrence kind of talked to me about early on, where I was very worried that, like, I wouldn't be able to write about wolves again. And I was like, it has to all be in here, so I have to make sure I just fill it with all the stuff I've ever wanted to write about wolves. And he was like, no. Chill out. Like, you can write another book.
There's
you could write a movie. You could write, you could write a poetry book about the wolves. Like, you don't know. So, grounded me a little bit in that. But no, it is, even now, when I'm writing, I'm like, oh, that would have been really good to have in here. And what I've actually started to do, where I'm writing my next collection I'm working on right now, and it's kind of a memoir and essays, again, thing, now that I know what that is, sort of. I don't know if anyone knows what that is.
Never.
It's like a lyric essay, right? Like,
Right.
It is what you want it to be.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I'm kind of thinking of it almost as a sequel, like, we would think of in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Where this one kind of ends around the time of my HIV diagnosis, a little bit after. And the next one's mainly about my diagnosis and all that came after that. And, it's also about video games and apocalypses and more wolves. So
nice.
It ends up being great. And so I try to just kind of keep reminding myself that, like, I'll be able to write about this again. And, I'm writing a piece in there about my baptism, which is also in this book. And there has been a lot of that stress of, like, how am I going to tell this story and not have it be really redundant? And how do I tell it differently? But I think because I'm at a different point in my life now, and I just understand myself in different ways, I'm in that trusting the process stuff that I force myself to do sometimes. I'm trusting that, like, it's going to come off different, and that my understanding of it is going to be a little bit different, and just hoping that people still want to hear about wolf stuff and weird things
forever. I tell my students this all the time. Like, we're always writing the same stories over and over again. We're just finding new ways to write them as we evolve as people.
Yeah,
like exactly. Your life becomes this evolution on the page as you write nonfiction, and it's like, how cool,
right? And I think that, like, fragmenting and braiding and doing different things like that allow automatically for a different way of telling the story, which is cool.
Great, thank you.
Yeah,
great question. Other questions?
Yep. In describing some of the Mormon practices, at one point you sort of parenthetically described it as fake or an invention and artifice. And I'm wondering, you subsequently describe how you explored this interest in myth and folklore, fairy tales. Like myth, like the word myth, it has like multiple meanings of both, on the one hand being a falsehood, but on the other hand being emotionally significant. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, like, your subsequent interest in explorations of myth and folklore and fairy tales, like, has been a way to, like, sort of reappraise Mormonism in your life and maybe come to peace with it, or see it as one body of myth among others, or is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something. I remember in that Norse mythology class, actually, that professor brought up the fact that they were doing a lot of research, in like biblical research, into how the Old Testament might have been like less of a true story thing and more of a, here are stories to help us understand and find morals, and almost essentially like how fairy tales turned out to be. And so when I started thinking about them connecting like that, I think it helped me understand, because you can't really determine what's true and what's not. And, there's just no way to actually know any of these things. So just for me personally, it helped me understand, like, okay, so this was a story that I was being told to kind of give me morals. And, you go into like the religion is this or religion is that, it's bad, it's good, But I think in the end, being able to think about it in the ways of myth and fairy tale and kind of connect it helped me write about it easier, because the stakes weren't quite so crazy. Because especially in Mormonism, as I kind of said in there, like to speak these things, to tell you that name, like would mean that I'm going to the deepest level of hell, you know. And so the stakes get really high. And so if I can start to bring those stakes down a little bit and make it just a more real experience, I think helps me write about it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. It's a good question. It's something I thought about a lot.
Yeah. Other questions? I think we probably have time for one more. One more.
We talked about your book.
I think I heard a question
That
about
was
the
the
book
quietest
cover. It's like one of the best covers I've seen in a really long time. I love it so much.
I am obsessed.
It's amazing. It's so good.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool because they essentially sent me a form that I had to fill out that was like, what are the themes of your book and what sort of messages do you think are most important? And then I had to send like my favorite 3 covers that I'd seen, and also like 5 images that I thought were artistically cool. And they sent it out to a bunch of their freelance artists, and they came back with this, and I immediately was like, yep, that's it. And I was so scared because it felt so important to me that the cover be what it needed to be. And so to have this as almost these costumes on a wall, while also looking like it could be a person walking and it could be a wolf walking in these different ways. Like there are a lot of kind of ways to see it.
I didn't even notice that, like the aerial sort of wolf walking. That's so cool.
And it like brings life and costuming and theater and all these things that I'm kind of talking about onto the cover, while also just that red is so striking that I just was obsessed with it from the second I saw it.
I love it so much.
It's very cool. Very fun.
Also, if you saw those bookmarks in the back, AJ designed them and made them.
You can have
So
one
you should grab
for
one.
being here. Yeah, please come and grab one. I have many.
I think, is that about time? Okay, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you very much for listening.